welcome to this week's lesson of the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we are going to discuss about basic pawn endgames, the breakthrough in pawn endgames, and the fact that even a pawn, a little pawn that's worth only 1 point, can give checkmate. You'll be surprised. Well, the first position we see on the board, white is 1 pawn ahead. But many times that's not enough to win. In pawn endgames, the main goal is trying to promote a passed pawn that you have, if you already have one. Like in this case, in fact, both white pawns on a4 and c2 are passed pawns. A passed pawn means that there's no other pawn, black pawn, in its file. So its way, its pass is free. Now, generally, you'd want to push the pawn that's closer to the promotion square. The promotion square is a8 or c8 in this case. So which pawn is closer, the a or the c? Well, obviously the a, it's only 1, 2, 3, 4 squares away from promoting, while its counterpart is clearly has a longer way to go. Now, another important consideration is how far is your opponent's king? Will it catch when it is walking in the direction of the passed pawn? Well, let's see. Let's say white pushes the a pawn to a5, which is definitely the right pawn to push. First of all, because it's closer to the promotion square, and second of all, because it's further from the opponent's king. Now, we can see that even though the black king is running, trying to catch that pawn, it arrives late. The pawn gets to promote to a new queen, and as we learned in lesson 1, having an extra queen is a relatively easy win to checkmate in the game. Let's go back to our starting position. And again, just to repeat, the correct starting move is to push the a5 pawn, and then the pawn is unstoppable. Well, let's go and see a next example, which is this position. Well, here the situation is not as simple as it was in the previous one. Because first of all, even though white's b pawn does not have a black counterpart on the b file, but the pawn on a6 is trying to stop its way. However, what's important in such situation is not necessarily to keep all your pawns, but oftentimes you don't mind giving up 1 pawn, or sometimes even 2 or 3, just in order to make sure one of your pawns will get across all the way to the other end of the board and will get promoted. Now also, at the same time, you always need to be aware of your opponent's possible threats and ideas. You need to notice that black also has a passed pawn that potentially can try to promote. And in fact, there is nothing in its way. And the white king is quite far from it too. The good news is in this case that white can still push the b4 pawn ahead, threatening to capture black's pawn on a6. For example, if black pushes the pawn, white can capture, black pushes, white pushes, black pushes, and the white pawn arrives first, and even controlling black's future potential promotion square on h1. But what happens if after b5, black captures the pawn on b5? Well, then finally we do have a passed pawn in the a5 pawn, and it's visibly clear that the black king is far away and there's no way that it can possibly catch our pawn. The white pawn is only 2 squares away from promotion, while the black pawn is 5 moves away from the promotion square. So white will clearly promote the pawn, and typically in most situations when one side has a queen and the other side has a pawn or 2 or 3 or even more pieces, the queen is stronger. As we know, the queen has a value of 9 points. That would equal potentially 9 pawns, or is still clearly more than a knight, which is worth 3 points plus 3 pawns, and so on. So the queen is a very, very valuable piece, and it's well worth the sacrifice of a pawn, or if it would be even of a bishop, just to get one pawn across and get the pawn promoted. Let's move on to the next position. And this is a very interesting position. Both sides have 2 pawns each. Well, it's quite clear that white's h-pawn is not a passed pawn at the moment because black has a counterpart on h6. Also, black's king is not particularly far from the white pawns that can potentially become queens. Let's see this situation. White can create a passed pawn by pushing the g4 pawn ahead. Pawn captures, pawn captures. So now white has a clear threat to advance the pawn to queen on g8. So in such situation, you need to try to calculate, will the black king catch that pawn in time? And what I mean by that is that the moment the white pawn promotes to a queen, would the black king ready to be capture that newly born queen? And let's see what's the case here. Black can play king d5, g6, king e6, g7, king f7, and as you can see, the black king is right next to white's pawn, ready to answer the pawn promotion by king takes queen, and of course, white cannot win. So let's go back to the starting position, and we'll realize that it's not as simple as it first seems. Yet, the good news for white is that white can still win here, but white needs to be tricky, and this is a very nice typical example of the breakthrough. So the first correct move is to play g5, as we said before. But then, after the pawn captures on g5, now surprisingly we're not capturing the pawn on g5, even though that would be the normal move, but it's a priority to try to promote the pawn to a queen. And the only way we can promote the queen and keep the queen on the board if the black king will not arrive in time to capture the newly born queen. And in this case, the unfortunate part for black is that black has a pawn on e5. If black could, by the rules, capture that pawn on e5, black would be just fine. But of course, black is not allowed to do that. You can never ever capture any of your pieces. So therefore, the black king has to try to go around, but then it arrives just one move too late. As you can see, the white pawn promotes and white wins. Let's see the next position. And in this position, white has a clear passed pawn. I bet you can think of how many moves white is away from the promotion square. Well, if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So white needs 5 moves to get to b8. Now the question is, how many moves does it take the black king to get there? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, and on the 5th move, the black king is ready to capture the newly born queen on b8. So that means if white pushes the pawn, king f4, white pushes, king e5, b6, king d6, b7, king c7, and when the pawn promotes, since there is no additional piece protecting the queen, the black king is ready to capture it, and game over. It's a draw. It's a tie. So the conclusion is, in this position, that the game is a draw. White cannot win this game. Now, on the other hand, let's see a similar but different position. In this position, white has a pawn on the A file, not on the B file. So if white keeps pushing the pawn one by one, black playing king e3, a4, king d4, a5, king c5, a6, seems to result pretty much a similar story as in the previous example. The black king catches the pawn just on time and then captures it on the following move. But let's go back to our starting position, and I'd like to point out to you something very important that you need to remember. In the beginning of each pawn's life, a pawn, while being in its initial square on the second rank, each pawn has a right to choose to move up one square or to move up right away 2 squares. Now, obviously, in a pawn endgame, when all the other pawns are gone already and all the other pieces are gone already, typically, you'd want to get towards the promotion square as quickly as you can. So therefore, you would want to move the pawn up 2 squares using the special right the pawn has before it has ever moved. Remember, each of the pawns have that own right. Even if one of your other pawns already moved 2 squares, each one of the pawns have that individual right. Now, as you'll notice, the black king cannot catch the white pawn because the black king does not have any special such right like the pawn that it in any situation can only always move 1 square at a time. So for example, now after king e3, pawn a5, king d4, a6, king c5, and the black king will always be 1 file behind the white pawn, and black is losing. And we're moving on to our 6th example in this lesson. And in this position, white again has an extra pawn, a passed pawn. Now this is a tricky one, and I'd like to point it out to you that if white would push the pawn right away by playing d4, that would be a big mistake, because the black king would succeed to get in front of the white pawn, and in this case that would result a theoretical drawn position, and I'll play it out for you to prove you why. King moves back, king e4, king e6. Even though white can advance the pawn all the way to the 7th rank, it will not be able to promote it to its ultimate goal, to the promotion square, without losing it. This is, by the way, a critical moment in similar and such pawn endgames, that it's very important that the black king goes in the middle, getting ready to meet white's king on either side, either after king e6 to king e8, or after king c6 to king c8. and then after either one, when the pawn advances, king d8, and now white can only choose between creating a stalemate, which as we know results the game in a draw, or the only other choices white has, moving away from the pawn, and then of course king takes, and again the game ends in a draw. So let's get back again to this position when white has a passed pawn. Now in such situation, it's very important to use our king to help. And after king d2, black cannot save the game, because after king f4, again white is not pushing the pawn, but brings the king to help from the side. And for example, after king e5, king c4, with the idea to then play king c5 and start marching the pawn up. And if the king moves to d6, now a very important move, the so-called opposition, the white king would move to d4, forcing the black king to move to either side or down. And when the king moves to the side, the white king would move to the other side, being there to help the white pawn march up. After king d7, another important move to gain even more territory, king d5, forcing the black king again to move to one side or another, king c6, king e6, and the pawn is ready to march. Just march, and again we force the king to go to one side or another, and there we go. The pawn is unstoppable, as you can see, with the king's help. Now the king protects the newly born queen, and therefore black cannot capture it. And we're moving on to the next position, and this is a very famous example of the breakthrough. Breakthrough is when there are several pawns of both colors, and one side would sacrifice one or more pawns in order to create finally a passed pawn that will be unstoppable and become a queen. I suggest that you try to figure out on your own how to get one of your pawns across and make it a queen. After you try to play it around with it by yourself and figure out the correct solution, come back and check out the correct move here. Well, the correct move is to push the middle pawn. Now, if the A pawn captures, then we do not capture back, because we would end up not having a passed pawn. But after b6, pawn takes, the correct move is a beautiful second pawn sacrifice, playing c6, threatening capturing black's pawn, and then to promote. And then when pawn takes, then we have a clear path to make a queen, and the pawn will get promoted. Let's go back to the starting position again. b6, what if the other pawn takes? Well, then we do the same thing from the other side, namely by playing a6. And when pawn takes, c6. It's important to notice that the black king is too far to catch the promotion square. Would the black king, for example, be like on e6? Of course, all these sacrifices would not work. But let's check out for a moment, could white have tried maybe something different? Like, for example, pushing the c pawn? Well, certainly could, but would not achieve the desired goal, that is to promote the pawn. Of course, black now needs to react to the threat, which is to capture black's pawn on b7. But if black notices that, black can choose from either capturing white's pawn, which would be safe, or even push the pawn up, and then after pawn takes pawn, of course not taking with the c-pawn when the white's c-pawn would advance, but simply capturing with the a-pawn, and it's only white who can lose here because the black king is quite close to run after white's pawn on b5. So, again, as a reminder, the correct solution here is to push the middle pawn, and then black is unable to stop one of the white pawns to promote. And now let's move on to a different subject. I just want to show you that in some cases it's kind of a rare situation, but it happens, and not to underestimate pawns. Because even though a little pawn is worth only 1 point, there are numerous situations when that 1 pawn can give checkmate. If you look at the position on the board right now, we'll see that black has an extra bishop, and both sides have a pawn each. However, you would also notice that the black king is right on the edge of the board and is surrounded by 2 of his own pieces, the bishop and the pawn. It also reminds me of the famous saying, when you see a good move, look, you may have a better one. At first you may think that white should capture black's bishop, as the bishop is a lot more valuable piece than a pawn. A bishop is worth 3 points, while a pawn only 1. But you'd have to recognize that white has absolutely no chance to win, as they have only their king left. So, you saw a decent looking move capturing a bishop. Time to look for a better one, and there is one, namely to push the pawn and attack black's king. You will notice that black cannot escape because of his own pieces. Black cannot get out on the g file because the white king is taking away all those squares from black's king. Quite an elegant checkmate. And finally, let's see another example. When black even has their queen. Black has a queen on f6 and a bishop. So black has major material advantage, a queen and a bishop versus a rook and pawn. So what should white do? Well, the good news is that the black king has no legal move, because the white rook is controlling all the squares on the 7th rank. That means the black king cannot go towards the 7th rank. And again, like in the previous position, black has 2 pieces on the side of the king, the bishop and the queen, taking away the escape square on d6 and f6. So, all we need to do is attack the king, because the 2 kings are opposite each other, and the white king is controlling the 3 squares on the 5th rank, where the black king could potentially escape to. And here, the checkmate is d5. Again, a beautiful example of how a pawn can become a hero. Well, I hope you enjoyed these ideas you learned. You may be able to use them yourself in one of your future games. Well, hope to have you back next week. Practice until then. and have fun playing chess. So long.